Welcome to Michigan's World War I Centennial News Report for September 2018, the Meuse Argonne Offensive. I'm your host, Dennis Skupinski. During this program, we're going to learn about the Meuse Argonne Offensive, the largest and final offensive that the American Expeditionary Force in France took part in. The State Report. On Friday, September 7th, Michigan's World War I Centennial Commission met at the Department of Military and Veteran Affairs building from 10 to 11. We discussed a number of topics. The minutes and agenda are online on the Michigan World War I Centennial website at www.1cc.org/Michigan. Some of the agenda items were the Capitol bell ringing ceremony taking place on Thursday, November 8th at 12 noon in the Capitol building. The Detroit Veterans Day Parade on November 11th at 11 a.m. The Bells of Peace bell ringing ceremony on November 11th at 11 a.m. We're asking all Americans across the nation to ring the bells of peace in remembrance of those who served and sacrificed in the war that changed the world. Locally, please contact Jerry Benson at the phone number and email above. The Lansing Silver Bells Parade, Friday, November 18th from 5 till 9 p.m. To learn more about Michigan's World War I Centennial or find out about events going on around the state, go to www.1cc.org/Michigan for the latest information on Michigan's World War I Centennial. A century ago, September 1918. On September 1st, 1918, the American Expeditionary Force Siberia landed in the Russian town of Vladivostok, Siberia. Their job was to protect Allied supplies, and they were part of a larger Allied contingent. On September 2nd and 3rd, 1918, the Canadian Expeditionary Force fought the Battle of Drocourt-Queant. The Canadians broke through the Hindenburg Line. One of the prizes was a German snare drum captured on September 2nd by the 72nd Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force. On September 3rd, 1918, 5 Negro soldiers were hung for alleged participation in the Houston or Camp Logan riot. In all, 19 mutineers were executed from the 24th Infantry, a Negro infantry regiment. On September 4th, 1918, the U.S. Army's North Russian Expeditionary Force lands in the Russian city of Archangel. They would stay 10 months. These men trained at Camp Custer and were part of the 85th Division. Most of the men were from Michigan. They would be later called the Polar Bears. On September 5th, 1918, the World Series begins a month early due to the World War. The Boston Red Sox defeat the Chicago Cubs. On September 12, 1918, the Battle of San Miele began. It involved the American Expeditionary Force and 110,000 French troops under the command of General John J. Pershing. It was against German positions. The U.S. Air Service played a significant role in the action. This battle marked the first time that the terms D-Day and H-Hour were used by the Americans. The attack at San Miele salient was part of the plan by Pershing, in which he hoped that the Americans would break through the German lines and capture the fortified city of Metz. On September 14, 1918, the Austro-Hungarian government sends a note to the Allies requesting peace discussions, but the Allies reject the offer. On September 26, 1918, the Meuse Argonne Offensive began. It involved 1.2 million American soldiers and was the largest offensive the United States military has undertaken in its history. It lasted until the end of the war, 47 days later. On September 12, 1918, the American Expeditionary Force in France launched an attack against the San Miele salient. The attack was commanded by General Pershing and involved 110,000 French troops besides the American newly created First Army. The attack was initially successful because it caught the Germans in the process of retreating, which meant that their artillery was out of place. But the U.S. attack faltered as artillery and food supplies were left behind on muddy roads. The attack on Metz was never realized, and the Germans refortified their position, and the Americans turned their efforts to the Meuse Argonne Offensive. With the conclusion of the San Miele offensive on September 16th, a new offensive, the Meuse Argonne, would begin on September 26th. The American Expeditionary Force would have to move from the San Miele region to the Verdun region and get its troops in position to be ready to launch the Meuse Argonne Offensive. Colonel George C. Marshall was responsible for the logistical coordination and planning of the Meuse Argonne Offensive. He had to move the American First Army from the San Miele region to the Verdun region, and also bring in new units to get ready to launch the attack on September 26th. 20 years later, George Marshall would become the Chief of Staff to Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. On September 26, 1918, the American Expeditionary Force began its strike north towards the city of Sedan. The Meuse Argonne Offensive was the biggest operation and victory of the American Expeditionary Force during World War I. The bulk of the American Expeditionary Force had not gone into action until 1918. The Meuse Argonne Battle was the largest frontline commitment of troops by the U.S. Army in World War I. The main U.S. effort of the Meuse Argonne Offensive took place in the Verdun sector, immediately north and northwest of the town of Verdun, between September 26 and November 11, 1918. However, the 27th and 30th Divisions, part of the 2nd Corps of the American Expeditionary Force, fought with the British command and spearheaded the attack on the Hindenburg Line with 12 British and Australian divisions. The American 27th and 30th Division, along with the Australian Corps, and with British artillery and tanks, the combined three-nation force, despite some early setbacks, attacked and captured their objectives. The battle centered around the underground section of the San Quentin Canal and became known as the Battle of the San Quentin Canal and marked the complete breach of the Hindenburg Line. The contributions of the Americans to the victory at the Battle of San Quentin is less well remembered than the Americans in the Meuse Argonne Offensive. The Battle of Meuse Argonne began with the American forces consisting of 15 divisions and formed into the 1st American Army. The Army was commanded by General John J. Pershing initially. On October 16th, General Pershing relinquished command of the 1st American Army to Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett. Pershing then became commander of the American forces in France. Flanking the American forces were the French, which consisted of 31 divisions under the 4th Army of General Henri Gouraud and the 5th Army under Henri Matthias Berthelot. The American divisions at the time were oversized. They had 12 battalions per division compared to the French, British, and German, which had 9 battalions per division. The British and the French provided most of the heavy equipment, such as the 2,780 artillery pieces, 380 tanks, and 840 planes that were used in the Meuse Argonne Offensive by the Americans. As the battle progressed, the U.S. Army provided 22 divisions, which is equivalent of 2 full field armies, to the Battle of Meuse Argonne. Opposing the American Army during the Battle of the Meuse Argonne were about 44 German divisions, anywhere between 200 to 400,000 German troops of the 5th Army, commanded by General George von der Marwitz. Most of the divisions were under strength for the German army. For example, the 117th Division had only 3,300 soldiers in its ranks, compared to an American division which had over 27,000 soldiers in it. The overall objective of the Meuse Argonne Offensive was to capture the railway hub at Sedan, which would break the German railway network supporting the German army in France and also in Flanders. Before the Battle of Meuse Argonne, the Allies expended during the 3 hours before H hour, which was 5:30 a.m. September 26th, more artillery ammunition than both sides did during the American Civil War. The cost was estimated at $180 million, or $1 million per minute. The American attack began at 5:30 on September 26th with mixed results. The 5th and 3rd Corps met most of their objectives, but some of the divisions failed to capture their objectives. Phase 1, in the words of General Pershing, we were no longer engaged in a maneuver for the pinching out of a salient, but were necessarily committed, generally speaking, to a direct frontal attack against a strong, hostile positions fully manned by a determined enemy. Phase 2 began on October 4th and lasted till October 28th. During this time, all the original assault divisions of the 5th Corps were replaced. They were the 91st, 79th, 37th, and 35th Divisions. They were replaced by the 32nd Division, the 3rd Division, and the 1st Division. The 1st Division created a gap in the lines when it advanced 2.5 kilometers against the 37th, 52nd, and 5th Guards Division of the German Army. It was during this phase that the Lost Battalion affair occurred. The Lost Battalion consisted of about 9 infantry companies of the 77th Division, roughly about 550 men. They were part of the 77th Division, which had advanced in the Argonne Forest. By the end, 197 were killed in action, 150 were missing or taken prisoner, and 194 men were rescued. They were led by Major Charles Whittlesey. On October 2nd, the 77th Division launched into the attack into the Argonne under the belief that French forces were supporting their left flank and 2 American units, including the 92nd Infantry Division, were supporting their right. Units of the 77th Division were making significant headway, especially the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry, commanded by Major Whittlesey. Unknown to them, units to the left and right had been stalled. The 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry continued to advance until eventually they were surrounded by German soldiers. It would be 6 days before they were rescued. Major Whittlesey tried to communicate his location to the American lines, but all of his runners were captured or shot, so they relied on carrier pigeons. One of the carrier pigeons delivered the wrong artillery coordinates, and so the Americans started bombarding the Lost Battalion. Carrier pigeon Cher Ami would become a hero by delivering the following message: "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sakes, stop it." Cher Ami had been shot through the breast, blinded in one eye, and had one leg hanging only by a tendon. The pigeon had been tended by the Army medics and was considered a hero of the 77th Division for helping save the lives of 194 survivors of the Lost Battalion. On October 8th, while the Americans were advancing into the Argonne Forest, Corporal later Sergeant Alvin York made his famous capture of 132 German prisoners near the town of Cornay. Sergeant York, for his actions on October 8, 1918, won a Congressional Medal of Honor. Sergeant York was from the state of Tennessee. Between October 14th and 17th, the American divisions launched a series of costly frontal attacks that finally broke through the German defenses known as the Hindenburg Line. The part of the Hindenburg Line they broke through was known as the Kriemhilde Stallung. The capture of the Kriemhilde Stallung was the most important moment in the entire battle, for the capture of this last German stronghold created the breakout that Pershing had sought. The third phase of the Meuse Argonne Offensive began October 28th and ended November 11th with the armistice. The Americans had advanced 9 1/3 miles and finally cleared the Argonne forest. On their left, the French had advanced 19 miles, reaching the River Aisne. The American forces were reorganized into two armies, the first led by Hunter Liggett and the second by Robert L. Bullard. The Second U.S. Army, led by General Robert Bullard, was directed to move eastward toward the town of Metz. During this phase, the American armies faced over 31 German divisions. The French in November captured the town of Sedan and its critical railroad hubs, while the Americans captured the surrounding hills. On November 11th, news of a German armistice put a sudden end to the fighting. The Meuse Argonne Offensive was the largest in the history of the U.S. military, involving 1.2 million American soldiers. It was one of a series of attacks known as the 100 Days Offensive. The battle cost the Germans about 28,000 lives and the Americans 26,277, and an unknown number of French soldiers. The Battle of the Meuse Argonne was the deadliest battle in the history of the United States. Losses were increased by the use of inexperienced troops, tactics used in the beginning phases of the operation, and widespread onset of the Spanish influenza. President Harry S. Truman was the only president who saw combat service during the First World War. He was a captain in Battery D, 129th Field Artillery, which was part of the Missouri National Guards. He was in the 35th Division and saw combat in the Meuse Argonne Offensive. Colonel George C. Marshall, logistic genius. Colonel Marshall had to plan the withdrawal of American forces after San Miele and provide for their relief by Allied or American units, designate the roads to be used on the way north, schedule traffic timetables, arrange for motorized and horse-drawn transport for troops, guns, equipment, and supplies, lay out camps and billets on the road and at the front, and work with the French to replace their units on the Meuse Argonne front with 9 huge American divisions that would lead the attack. All this had to be done as secretly as possible, preferably at night, lest the Germans observe the movement and bombard the packed roads with their formidable artillery. The Lost Battalion happened during the Meuse Argonne Offensive from October 2nd to October 6th, when the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry, commanded by Major Charles Whittlesey, and his battalion advanced into the Argonne Forest. His flank support stalled. Eventually he became surrounded by German soldiers and for 6 days fought them off. Major Charles Whittlesey and Carrier Pigeon Cherami became heroes. On October 8th, when the Lost Battalion was rescued, they roughly had 197 killed in action, 150 missing or taken prisoner, and 194 remained. The 32nd Division, during tough combat in France during the First World War, acquired the French nickname of Les Terribles, referring to its fortitude in advancing over terrain others could not. It was the first Allied division to pierce the Hindenburg line of defense. The 32nd Division adopted the shoulder patch of a line shot through with a red arrow to signify its tenacity in piercing the enemy line. It became then known as the Red Arrow Division. The 32nd Division was made up of National Guardsmen from Michigan and Wisconsin. Lieutenant Frank Luke Jr., 27th Aero Squadron, known as the Arizona Balloon Buster, died September 29, 1918 during the Meuse Argonne Offensive, shooting down 3 balloons that day. Eddie Rickenbacker wrote about Frank Luke, "He was the most daring aviator and the greatest fighter pilot of the entire war. His life was one of the brightest glories of our air service. He went on a rampage and shot down 14 enemy aircraft, including 10 balloons, in 8 days. No other ace, even the dreaded von Richthofen, had ever come close to that." Lieutenant Frank Luke Jr. was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions. Sergeant Alvin C. York was one of the most decorated soldiers of the United States Army in France. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor for leading an attack on a German machine gun nest, taking at least one machine gun, killing at least 25 enemy soldiers, and capturing 132. York's Medal of Honor action occurred during the Meuse Argonne Offensive in France on October 8, 1918, while they were trying to breach the Hindenburg Line.